Malaysia is one of Asia's largest net importers of labour, taking in more than 1 million workers from Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh and Pakistan. The question is, what are the economic and political outcomes that come out of this? What new tensions has this produced on the ground in light of already existing intercommunal problems? What strategies are migrant workers adopting to afford more visibility to their plight? This week, we'll explore the lives of the marginalised groups in Malaysia. The topics will touch on migrant workers, refugees, Muslim minorities and the indigenous people here.
News about Orang Asli or Malaysia Aboriginal people such as these will come up into the news from time to time. But eventually, most forms of abuse and injustice faced by them will fade into oblivion. Perhaps it reflects the general position of Orang Asli in Malaysia's social fabric. Today, we will explore more about Orang Asli, the sideline narratives of indigeneity, and their position fits in Malaysia, particularly in regards to the major Bumiputra groups in Malaysia, the Malays. Orang Asli, or Aboriginal people, is an umbrella category consisting of 18 sub-ethnic groups, which in turn categorizes into 3 larger groups which loosely based on language. For example, Saman, Negrito, Senoi, and Melayu Asli. Now, rather than identifying them based on their sub-ethnicity, most of them identified themselves as Orang Asli. These groups are non-Malay indigenous people that have occupied the Malay Peninsula before the Malay Kingdom was established in the 2nd millennium AD. This current grouping could make people wonder of the state of these 18 sub-ethnic groups, whether their sub-ethnic identities have diminished or have experienced any changes ever since they fell under the major grouping of Orang Asli.
Right. I don't think it's really an homogenization of the different Asli groups or in this Pan-Asal group, but it is really a coalition. It's bringing different groups of people who are, Malaysian Aboriginal, people from Sabah and Sarawak, and it's a matter of coming together because many of these Asli groups are in some way or the other marginalized in Malaysia, and so it is essentially a group of people coming together because of various sorts of shared politics and also working together in the collaborative way in terms of trying to to come up with better sort of lives for themselves.
However, not much is known about them, including by many Malaysians, as shown in the excerpt in this piece, where an Orang Asli activist, Tija, commenting on how many Malaysians are not aware about Orang Asli.
The question that you've just asked is a question that is commonly asked by many Malaysians. They say, oh, we do not know much about the Orang Asli. But because they are private or they don't talk about themselves or we don't hear their voices. And the reason we don't hear the voices is because they haven't had the opportunity to express their voices much. And furthermore, often, when you have media attention or when you have someone goes in with a television camera to document the lives of the Orang Asli, they often document to present a very exotic aspect of the Orang Asli. And what's missing here is that their cultural, the very rich, cultural stories, the narratives, the various beliefs and value systems that they have, and I think that's really missing. The other thing too is that there is a lot of material available on the Orang Asli. Lots of books have been written. For example, I've written 3 books on the Orang Asli. Many of my fellow anthropologists have written books. There is even an Orang Asli author, Akia, and Akia has written several novels drawing from his experiences in the Orang Asli. But I don't think that many people know about him. There are several fabulous Orang Asli leaders, like Bar Tony, like Zanisa and Tija, and they all have on a consistent basis, they have been writing about the Orang Asli. They have been writing both in English and as well as in Bahasa Malaysia. But the unfortunate thing is that very few people actually access that kind of work. And I don't think Orang Asli can be left alone because first of all, we have to keep in mind that Orang Asli have never been alone. They've never lived in, although one would believe that they have lived in remote areas and isolated. But you know that the Orang Asli have been involved in the trading of forest products ever since the 1st century AD. So they have in fact been trading with Arab and Indian traders in supplying a lot of the different kinds of products, spices and various sorts of products from the forest. So there's a very long-standing trading relations that Orang Asli have held with people from the outside. But so I think it's in a way, it is a misconception to say that Orang Asli are isolated. So they've never been left alone and they don't want to be left alone. We also have to keep in mind that the reason that many Orang Asli live in remote and isolated places is because many of them have been the victims of slave raiding. In the past, they've been taken as slaves, and for Orang Asli there is a very strong fear of the outside world, primarily because they see people who come from the outside world as potential slave raiders. Now, taking that into consideration, we have to perhaps understand, from the perspective of the Orang Asli, what they've had to go through in terms of the various sorts of, in their history, slave raiding, exploitation from outside people. Well, first of all, we have to keep in mind the fact that Orang Asli have always had connections with the outside world, connections with other people. In fact, many of the Orang Asli have married. There are non-Orang Asli that have married into Orang Asli communities. So you have Malays, Chinese, Indians who have in fact taken Orang Asli as their partners and lived with Orang Asli. So Orang Asli are very inclusive in that sense. But the other thing to also consider is that we tend to make this distinction between Orang Asli and non-Orang Asli. Wherever we have this problem of the Orang Asli, I think this distinction that we make tends to be unhelpful, primarily because I think it's important that all Malaysians should be concerned of the fact that there is a group of people like the Orang Asli who have been marginalized. The marginality is reflected in the life expectancy, reflected in the incidence of disease found in these many Orang Asli. It is also reflected in the impoverishment of Orang Asli in terms of the poor diet and nutrition that they have. So all these various factors that come in, and I think all Malaysians would need to, in fact, not be concerned about this, dualism or this kind of distinction that's made between Orang Asli and non-Orang Asli. Everyone should be concerned about the fact that there is a group of people like the Orang Asli who have been marginalized, they have been discriminated and treated unequally in this country. So while yes, of course, the Orang Asli are different, but we also have to keep in mind that the Orang Asli are the first peoples of Malaysia. They are the indigenous peoples in this country.
As for those who are aware of Orang Asli's existence, they might think that Orang Asli falls under the category of Bumiputra, which literally means sons of soil. Those who are under the Bumiputra groups receive several special privileges, such as easier access to public universities and employment in the public sector. However, although they are considered as the earliest inhabitant of the Malay Peninsula, they are not officially included in the Bumiputra group, despite the tendency to be considered as one. In other words, they do not receive the Bumiputra privileges unlike the Malays and the natives of Sabah and Sarawak. For example, although Article 8, Section 5C of the Federal Constitution has a provision that allows the reservation of position in public sector for the Orang Asli, In reality, the government has not actually enacted such legislation. The only special privileges that the Orang Asli have is to hunt protected game and collected forest products for their own consumption when living in the forest reserves. However, although the Orang Asli have these privileges, which one could argue has enabled them to maintain their traditional lifestyle, this may be affected by the resettlement program that were implemented from 1979 to 1995.
So in the past, Malaysian Aboriginal people were enticed to move away from the homelands and to live in these resettlement projects, primarily because the government forces wanted to deny the commoners of the support of Malaysian Aboriginal people, especially those people that live in the forest and in the jungle, which is where the commoners' activities were conducted. So for national security reasons. I think it's important to keep in mind that the resettlement programs that the Malaysian government has undertaken for Orang Asli groups, these resettlement programs were supposed to be for the betterment of the Orang Asli, and in many cases, these projects were undertaken alongside with a number of different development and economic projects. However, one also needs to consider the fact that Malaysian Aboriginal people have been displaced as a result of many of these resettlement projects. At times, these projects are carried out in areas where Orang Asli lands have been used for various other purposes. So you have Felda land schemes that have been carried out in certain Orang Asli areas where Orang Asli have been resettled away from that land. You have logging that have taken place in some parts of Malaysia. Once again, Orang Asli have been displaced. We have various large infrastructural projects. For example, University Kebangsaan Malaysia is located on what used to be Orang Asli land. We also have the KLIA airport. One of the runways goes right across Orang Asli land. So one has to ask this question, in fact, is there always the fact that Orang Asli have gained economically or socially from resettlement programs? The other thing to also keep in mind is that many of these resettlement programs have been adopted as a result of security issues. So in the past, Malaysian Aboriginal people were enticed to move away from the homelands and to live in these resettlement projects, primarily because the government forces wanted to deny the commoners of the support of Malaysian Aboriginal people, especially those people that live in the forest and in the jungle, which is where the commoners' activities were conducted. So for national security reasons. But you also have Orang Asli that have been resettled for the construction of dams, for example, where their lands have been flooded. So I wouldn't say that resettlement is always for the benefit of the Orang Asli. In fact, I would even be bold enough to say that, and contentious, to say that resettlement has actually brought much greater problems to the Orang Asli. And my research and my studies, in fact, have indicated that.
However, the price of cash crops depended on the price of the market and does not necessarily guarantee the economic welfare of the Orang Asli. The income generated by these cash crops are usually insufficient to support their lives, forcing them to eventually abandon these cash crops and fend themselves using means such as selling forest products to other people. From practicing Sweden cultivation, nowadays many people grow cash crops such as oil palm and rubber and lead lives as sedentary farmers. Of course, the change of their economic activities will also affect the Orang Asli's culture. However, Dr. Gomez is optimistic about their culture.
Personally, I think that it's not really possible for anyone to lose one's culture, because what happens is that culture is something that's dynamic, but it's also important to keep in mind that rather than losing one's culture, there is a strong possibility that one will gain new cultural practices and new cultural beliefs. So I think this notion that one can actually lose one's culture is problematic. But however, there are certain practices that Malaysian Aboriginal people might have, which might be difficult to practice at the moment, given that many of them have been removed from their forest areas, and certain beliefs that they have that are connected and associated with their lives in the forest might be difficult to continue in a different kind of lifestyle. So yes, you might think that they may have lost certain aspects of those cultures, but I don't think they would have in any way lost their culture. And the other thing to also keep in mind is that Malaysian Aboriginal people culture is very dynamic. It is also a culture that's growing, and the Malaysian Aboriginal culture tends to be very inclusive. So they would adopt certain kinds of cultural practices from other groups of people in Malaysia and incorporate that into their own culture.
The legal position of the Orang Asli is defined under the Aboriginal Peoples Act 1954, which was enacted by the colonial government. It has only received a minor amendments in 1956, 1958 and 1967. Under this law, the welfare of Orang Asli is placed under JKOA, who is responsible for a range of matters in the Orang Asli's life, for example, land, housing, education and healthcare. It is also responsible to determine who can be considered as Aborigines. However, the Act created a paternalistic relation between government officials and the Orang Asli. For instance, the government regulated entrance by non-Orang Asli people into Orang Asli villages, the type of crops they can grow, and the land transactions that Orang Asli do. This paternalistic control has created mentality among the government officials, general Malaysian public, and even the Orang Asli themselves that the latter are not capable in doing anything without the government's assistance or approval. To a certain extent, this patriarchal relationship penetrates the religion choice of the Orang Asli, as this will influence their qualifications to be a Bumiputra. There seems to be an effort to absorb the Orang Asli into the Malay population. For instance, there was an active conversion of Orang Asli into Islam in 1970s. In all censuses since 1970, the Orang Asli are counted as Malays, while in the government statistic, they appear as Malays or Bumiputra. Since most Malaysians can speak Malay and there are other few customs that can be recognized as exclusively belong to the Malays, Islam is considered as the sole distinct identity marker for people who are considered as Malay and people are not. Thus, sometimes a Muslim convert will be equated as becoming Malay, although they are not originally born as ethnic Malay. In addition, when filling up government forms, most Orang Asli are torn whether to stick with Malay or others. Some Orang Asli might be officially considered as Muslims, but might have little knowledge about its doctrine and do not follow its practices. In addition to be administrated paternalistically by the JHEOA, it seems that a set of circumstances has been created for the Orang Asli, where the only way they could only attain rights like any normal citizens is by changing their ethnicity. This creates a dilemma for them as Orang Asli, like other indigenous in the world, who are strongly opposed in giving up on their culture, religion, and identities.
Now, the very fact that you consider the Orang Asli to be the other itself is troubling, because then you are saying that the Orang Asli is, someone that's different from the other Malaysians in the country. Perhaps let's think of ways of how we consider Orang Asli to be like us. Firstly, they are the Malaysian citizens. They are, the first peoples of Malaysia. They are, people that we should respect, and they are, people that are entitled to a much better life than they have at the moment. And rather than thinking of them as other, let's think of them as being one of us, who have been, unfortunately been disadvantaged and marginalized.
At this point, the Orang Asli should be made visible, but not only being exoticized by other people, especially fellow Malaysians. Any effort to improve their livelihood and welfare need to have proper consultation with them so that those efforts will not bring any adverse effect to their lifestyles.